In the previous video, we saw that our judgments often begin from an initial impression, interpretation, or reference point. We also saw that our final judgments frequently remain tied to those starting points more than we realize. At this point, you might be wondering, if we know that anchors can bias our judgments, why can't we simply ignore them? The answer turns out to be surprisingly complicated. Let's begin with an observation that researchers have made repeatedly. Expertise offers less protection than we might expect. Consider the study by Gregory Northcraft and Margaret Neale, in which experienced real estate agents and undergraduate business students were asked to estimate the value of a home. Everyone in the study received detailed information about the property, including a listing price. But the listing prices weren't all the same. Half of the participants were given a low listing price, and half were given a higher listing price. The question Northcraft and Neale were interested in was how would this influence the participants' estimate of the value of the home. Based on prior work, they fully expected the undergraduate students to show an anchoring effect. But would the realtors, who had more knowledge about the housing market and a lot of experience, also be influenced by the listing price? The result was striking. Yes, both the experts and novices were influenced by the listing price. The realtors were generally better at estimating value than the undergraduate students. Okay, good for them. But they were still pulled toward the initial asking price. Perhaps even more surprising, the realtors often denied that the listing price had influenced them at all. This finding highlights an important point. Anchoring is not simply a problem of ignorance or inexperience. Even knowledgeable people use starting points when making judgments under uncertainty. So why are anchors so difficult to escape? One reason is that anchors help organize our thinking. When we encounter uncertainty, our minds naturally search for a reasonable place to begin. An initial impression or reference point reduces the number of possibilities that we need to consider. This is often helpful. Imagine trying to estimate the population of a city, negotiate a salary, or evaluate a job candidate without any starting point whatsoever. Judgment would become slow, cognitively demanding, and maybe even impossible. But there is a trade-off. The very feature that makes anchors useful can also make them dangerous. Because we begin with an initial interpretation, we may not move far enough away from it when new information arrives. That's why Kahneman and Tversky called this an anchor, because it weighs us down. The tendency toward insufficient adjustments helps explain why people often fail to recognize the influence of these anchors. From our perspectives, we feel like we carefully considered the evidence and arrived at an independent judgment. And in one sense, we did. We adjusted. The problem is that we may not have adjusted enough. Researchers have also discovered that some anchors are more influential than others. Anchoring effects tend to be stronger when we are uncertain. When we lack knowledge about a topic, such as with the undergraduate students in the study we discussed a few moments ago, or when we are under time pressure. In contrast, expertise and careful analysis can sometimes reduce anchoring effects, but they rarely eliminate them entirely. Another important distinction involves the source of the anchor itself. Some anchors come from the environment around us. A listing price, a first offer, a suggested estimate. Other anchors are self-generated. Suppose I asked you how many books are in your local public library. Even if you have no idea of the actual answer, you probably wouldn't begin at 0. You might start with a number that seems plausible based on your prior experiences, and then adjust from there. In other words, we often provide our own starting points. This means that simply removing external anchors would not completely solve the problem. Our own knowledge and assumptions can sometimes become anchors just as well. So, can we protect ourselves from anchoring? Research suggests that doing so is remarkably difficult. Simply learning about anchoring is usually not enough. Knowing that anchors exist does not automatically free us from their influence. However, there are several strategies that can help. Actively considering alternative starting points, deliberately generating counter-arguments, seeking objective reference information, and delaying important judgments can sometimes reduce the influence of anchors. These are all methods that, as Kahneman would say, engage our system 2 deliberative processes. But none of these strategies completely eliminate the problem. And that brings us back to a broader question. Should we think of anchoring as a flaw in human reasoning, or should we think of it as an adaptive shortcut that usually works, but occasionally leads us astray? Researchers disagree. The Heuristics-and-biases tradition associated with Tversky and Kahneman emphasizes that systematic errors and that these can result from anchoring and insufficient adjustment. In contrast, the fast-and-frugal perspective argues that people often make surprisingly effective judgments with limited information and limited time. From this viewpoint, beginning with a reasonable starting point and adjusting from it may often be an efficient strategy. The truth is that both perspectives capture something important. Anchors can mislead us. They can distort negotiations, influence medical decisions, and shape our impressions of other people in ways we do not fully understand. But anchors also provide a practical solution to a difficult problem. They give us a place to begin. The challenge for good judgment is not to eliminate starting points altogether. That would probably be impossible. Instead, the challenge is learning when to trust our starting points and when to question them, and when the situation calls for a more deliberate search for alternative possibilities. Because in the end, where we begin often shapes where we end up. But understanding that process can help us become more thoughtful judges and decision makers.